Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum.
Hello, y'all, and welcome back to another episode of the Red Text Podcast. I'm your co-host, Ry, aka the Mestizo Mystic on Instagram.
And my name is Voga, and I am Voga Illumisente.
And today we have a returning guest that we had on, what was it, our first season, right?
Yeah, this one is family. This one is a friend to the podcast. We love this one very, very much.
Yeah, we have Chris Ziegler, aka, what's your handle on Instagram, Chris?
Exegete.
And go ahead and introduce yourself, pronouns, a little bit about yourself for our audience who maybe haven't followed your profile or heard the episode with you quite yet.
I am Chris, pronouns he, him. Some of you might know me on Instagram. I'm Tarot Exegete. It's Tarot, T-A-R-O-T, Exegete, E-X-E-G-E-T. So it's like I look at the tarot cards the way a biblical exegete looks at the scripture, kind of breaking it down, analyzing it, finding new meanings, stuff like that. The reason I call myself that is because I was once in a Catholic seminary. So I was studying to be a Catholic priest, and I had a concentration in scripture. So I really loved scripture and doing exegesis in the classical way. While I was there, I sort of had a crisis of faith, and one thing led to another, and I left. And then after leaving, I took up tarot and really ran with tarot, and that's what I'm still doing. So follow me if you haven't followed me. And today, I hope to talk about some of the things I learned in seminary and some things they didn't teach me, but I've learned since.
Love that. Listen, if anyone is in any way, not even if you read, even if you're not a reader, just go and follow Chris, because the wealth of knowledge that he posts on his Instagram is priceless. So go and follow. And also, I have to tell you, because I haven't had the chance to tell you, your production value and your editing has really come up. I love your videos so much now. It feels very very polished, very edited, very aesthetic. I love the way that you produce your videos, your reels on your Instagram. So well done on that. But also at the same time, the information is absolutely incredible. A lot of the things that you actually post about, I incorporate into my own practice, because it's very like the perspective shifts every single time I watch one of your reels, because I'm just like, oh my God, where the hell did that come from? I didn't even see that. Because really, truly a wealth of knowledge, and the connections that you make between I don't know if that's me. The connections you make with between theology and the tarot and the symbology is absolutely incredible. So please go follow Tarot Exegete on Instagram. I've been following Chris for the better part of 2 years now, and I have gotten nothing but really great information from him. So, and also you were on our podcast last season, and it's still one of my favorite episodes that we've ever produced, because it was probably the most information dense, but it was probably the one where I learned the most. Where we talked about the Psalms. That was such a great episode, and a lot of people loved it. So but yeah, before we get into it, let's start with Chris. Chris, how are you?
I'm doing great. I'm on TikTok now too.
Oh yay. TikTok is another monster. TikTok is kind of a TikTok makes me nervous. So it's good.
Start doing videos, you can share the same video again on TikTok. So I was like, why not just post it twice?
Might as well.
Have,
Yeah.
have a little following over there too. But I'm going well. I'm living in upstate New York now. It's very quiet and peaceful up here. Living a little apartment in the woods, sort of.
Ooh, that sounds wonderful. Because before, when we first recorded, you were in Virginia. Was that correct?
New Jersey.
Oh, New Jersey. Oh, I'm sorry. So,
Yeah.
apologies. Oh, okay. So now you're in upstate New York. That's nice. I would. Oh God, I would just kill to live in a little apartment in the woods. That sounds so wonderful.
That sounds beautiful.
Yeah. Rye, how are you, my darling?
I'm good. I'm so sweaty. I don't know what's happened to me in the last couple of years. I used to not sweat at all, and now I get like hot and I'm just no, I'm good. I want to be back in the woods. I just had a week-long intensive retreat for school. Last week we were at a retreat center in Los Gatos, which is like pretty close to Santa Cruz. But we were in like the hills of Los Gatos, and it was just so nice every morning to wake up and just pray and meditate like amongst a valley of trees surrounding us. It was the most gorgeous thing, and it made me want to move out of San Francisco, and I still actually kind of have that feeling, but my partner only just moved here not even a year ago yet, so I don't think that's going to be quite feasible just yet. But I just want to live in nature. But
Yeah.
other than that, I'm okay. I'm okay. Not
Good.
bad. Yeah. How are you?
I'm fine. I would be better if it wasn't 100 degrees in LA. It's 100 degrees in LA. It peaked at 104 today, and I wanted to jump off a building. It was so bad. It was really, really bad. I'm telling you, this weather is not good for gothy girl like me. It's not good for my wardrobe. It's not good for my wigs. It's not good for my makeup. I can't do it. It's too bad. Like, it's too bad. Like once it hits like 75, I start getting cranky. Like I start getting cranky like around 75. Anything below 70, I'm in heaven, right? And that only happens maybe like 3 months out of the year. The rest of it is like over 70, and I can't do it.
Move to San Francisco.
You say it like it's so easy. It's so like, well, at the same time, it's like the price of living in San Francisco is basically the same thing as living here in LA. So it's like, it really isn't that big of a difference. But I get to live for free here, babes. I'm still with my parents, so I ain't going nowhere. I ain't going I'm not paying rent. So my ass is staying right here. But yeah, I'm doing great. I started a new job this week, a new clinic, and it's going swimmingly. I feel so much more peaceful. I feel so much less stress. I feel just, I have more time to just dedicate to myself than just spending so much time at work. I feel great. Everything is really coming up. So right now I'm doing really, really well, and I'm so excited because Chris is here. Chris is like one of my favorite people on the internet, so having Chris here makes me feel really, really good. So but anyways, going into that, let's just segue right into the topic. Chris, I think Chris is going to be the perfect person to introduce the topic to us, and I implore our audience, because having a conversation with Chris is basically like going to school. So take out a pen and a pad and take some notes, because I'm pretty sure this is going to be a nice and dense in information. So Chris, what are we talking about today?
So the topic is, did the most famous person in history actually exist?
Are you talking about Paul McCartney or Jesus?
Of course I'm talking about Jesus. Was there historical Jesus is the question.
The historical Jesus. Yeah, this is actually, when you approached us about this topic, I was just like, this is interesting, because I never really thought of like the biblical, like, because I've always kind of conflated the idea of the historical Jesus and the biblical Jesus. So like, I want to kind of separate them a little bit and see what the perspective is, because this is really food for thought.
Yeah, I'm not really sure how y'all feel about that. You never know when you drop something like that how people react, because some people, they're not Orthodox Christians, but they'll still be very offended by the suggestion, right, that there may not have been a historical Jesus. The position that there was no historical Jesus, it's called mythicism, like mythicism. It's not the majority position among scholars, but that is changing, and more you're hearing more scholars come out and adopt this position, and it's entering the debate more and more. Most theological departments and universities, they're very dominated by Christians and people who are attached to seminaries or who are funded by various Christian groups. So this whole area of study has always been very politicized, and the field has been tilted towards a Christian bias. So for that reason, mythicism has always been a kind of a fringe position. But like I said, we're starting to see that change in recent years, and more books are being published. I'll list some of them later. So
you're saying, I'm sorry, I don't know, but like within like the last 10, 15 years, you're starting to see more scholars believe that there wasn't a historical Jesus, or is this?
Yeah, I would say since the late 90s, more books have been published along these lines.
So almost 30 years.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's interesting.
Here's that.
Go on.
I said, why is that? Like, why do you think that is? Or what have you like kind of witnessed that like lends to that increase of more people leaning towards the mythic narrative?
Well, a lot of these things you couldn't publish for a long time or couldn't think about. And even today, again, like I said, most theological departments, they're funded by religious groups.
Oh, right. That makes a lot of sense. So it was gate cap. They were censored. Okay, I understand.
There's a lot of gatekeeping, yeah. But even among scholars who are critical of Christianity, like Bart Ehrman, he still doesn't take the mythicist position, really. So one way to think about mythicism is like, I use the example of the Big Lebowski. Like, let's say there's a group of people who think the Big Lebowski movie is history. Like, this isn't just a fun story. This is like history, right? Mm-hmm. And then you could say, like, a mythicist would say, well, no, the dude isn't real, right? Well, what does that mean? Does that mean like there was nobody in LA in the early 90s named the dude? Like, no, probably there was, right? Was there somebody who was sort of had some of the characteristics of the dude who lived in LA in the early 90s? Yeah, probably. But did this story like literally actually happen? No.
I see what you're saying. Okay.
So this isn't historical, and if it's not like tightly based on a real person, then it's a kind of myth. It's a made up. It's literature. It's not history. It's literature. But what I'm going to try to show you and argue is that the Gospels are like that. They're not. There may have been a Jesus. There almost certainly was a Jesus in first century Palestine. There were probably, as I'll argue, there were probably Jesuses who were messianic leaders at that time. But what you have to understand is the story we've gotten in the scriptures and the Gospels, the Jesus that's come down to us in history, is not only not factual, not based on literal historical events, it's actually an inversion and a subversion of the truth. And that'll make sense later when I explain more. So it's like saying that, the Big Lebowski, it's like not only was it not a literal or true story, but the dude that it was based on was totally unlike the dude we get in the movie. So when we're talking about the historical Jesus, people like to look at, there's two bodies of evidence. There's the Bible, obviously, and everything written in the Bible. But people who want to prove that Jesus existed, he says, okay, we had to have some kind of evidence for him outside the Bible, right? So outside the Bible, what do we have? What evidence do we have that Jesus was a real person? Mm-hmm. Well, there's very, very little. There's very little. There are two historians who mention him. One of them is named Josephus, and he's very important because he's our only other source for the history of first century Palestine. Josephus was a Jewish man who, during the Jewish War, which I'll talk about later, he defected to the Romans, and he became a court historian of the Roman emperors, and he wrote a history. He wrote two books, one called The Jewish War, about the war between the Romans and the Jews, and he wrote a book called The Antiquities of the Jews. And in the Antiquities of the Jews, there are two times he mentions Jesus. One is very brief, in passing mention. He mentions John the Baptist, and then he mentions James the Righteous, James the Just, who we'll mention later, who's a very important figure. And he says James had a brother named Jesus. And then in another part of the book, he has a longer paragraph about Jesus, and this is known as the Flavium Testimonum. It's the testimony of the Flavians, because Josephus was adopted by the Flavian emperors, so we took the name Flavian. And this passage is very controversial. So there's something called interpolation. Do you know what interpolation is?
No.
No.
Interpolation is when you have a text and you insert something new into it. So let's say like wrote a letter he wanted to give to you, right? But before it gets to you, he gives it to me. And before you see it, I take the letter and I write it out again, and I add a line, which and write. And then I give it to you. That's interpolation. So
is that information necessarily true, or is it something that is made,
well,
or is it both?
If I'm giving you a letter written by for you, and I add something that right, that's kind of a lie, right? If I'm passing it off as something.
Oh, I see. Okay, no, because I was assuming that I would be aware that you added something.
No, you're not aware.
I see. Okay, so it's
lying.
I gotcha.
So, in text criticism, they call that interpolation. When somebody, a later writer or copyist, adds a word, a sentence, a paragraph, a whole page, that's called interpolation. So what you have to know about the first 4 or 5 centuries of Christianity is that this happened all the time. The scriptures are heavily interpolated, Old and New Testament. So many of the other documents that were produced during that time are full of interpolations. And one of the ways you can tell something is interpolated is if it either doesn't match the writing style of what's around it, or it has something which contradicts something else in the piece, or if the line that's been interpolated isn't mentioned by other writers. So let's say you have a work by somebody, and then like a century later, there's another writer commenting on that work, and then he doesn't mention a certain line, and then a century later, you have somebody commenting on that line. You see, that implies that the line was inserted between the first and second commentator. You see what I mean?
Yeah, it's a really vicious game of telephone.
Yeah.
What you have to understand is that there was a lot of fraud going on in the first couple of centuries of Christianity, and the early Christians were guilty of a lot of fraud, and it's created a lot of puzzles in the scriptures, which is why there's so many contradictions. There were these things.
I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. I just want to say it's like I mean we are aware of that. We're 100% aware that there was definitely some fraudulence in regards to the scripture and what I was actually being taught. But to be able to put a word to it is very interesting. Interpolation is something that I never heard of, and being able to like see it that way, and also it adds perspective to see. Like we always called it a game of telephone when it came to the word of the word of mouth. In kind of spreading the gospel, right? That's what we always call. We always meant like referred it to as like word of mouth, or like I said, telephone. But it was in a way that was more innocent and like non-intentional. And what you're saying is that it seems very intentional. That there was that the game of telephone was actually very, very intentional. It was something that they actually wanted to do to influence the gospel, to influence the story of Christ, to influence it in a way that maybe favors them in some way. But yeah, it's interesting to actually hear that word kind of plugged in now, because it makes it so much more. It's interesting because I always know there was a little bit of like ugliness when it came to spreading the gospel, especially because it was word of mouth. So I think the perspective of seeing that it was actually intentional, there's a lot of intent in influencing the gospel and what word was actually spread to kind of influence what people learned and knew and how they practiced. Very interesting.
Yeah, unfortunately, there was a lot of sinister intent behind a lot of this, and it was intentional. So the opposite of interpolation would be omission, right? Deleting a line. The problem there is it's deleted. We don't have it, so we don't know what we don't know. But in interpolation, when you read the text carefully, you can tell when a line's been interpolated because there's always some discrepancy. Like, if they say if you watch any movie, because the movie is fictional, there's always a contradiction. There are people who watch films very carefully and they say like, oh, like that scene, that contradicts what happened earlier. There's
Right,
always
because
some
it's made up. Yeah.
There's always some little contradiction. Like
There's like a hole in the story. Yeah.
plot holes, right? Because the story is made up, and any made up story is always going to have plot holes because it didn't happen. So there's always going to be little things you miss. So that's true of the scriptures. It's full of plot holes and these contradictions, which are the result of the interpolations. So not only did the Christians interpolate their own scriptures, as we'll get to later. If you want an example, a very easy example of interpolation, the Gospel of John. So it has 21 chapters, right? When you get to the end of chapter 20, there's kind of this sign-off from the author. He's like, here, the story of Jesus is now ended, and if I could go on, I can go on, but I can't fill up all these books, and then it's sort of like a very clear, like, okay, signing off now, the author of the Gospel of John, and then there's another chapter. So it's like, why would he end the gospel and then add another chapter? Unless that was the original ending, and then somebody came along later and had this story and tacked it on.
Right, it was somebody else. Oh my God, that's so interesting. Okay.
Well, all scholars agree that the 21st chapter of John wasn't originally part of the text, but someone later, wanted to preserve the story, and they just added it to the end. So that's a very obvious and easy interpolation to find. So not only did Christians interpolate their own scriptures, but they interpolated other works too, works by historians. And this mention from Josephus of Jesus is heavily interpolated. And the reason we can tell is because he calls him the Christ, which is weird because he's Jewish, and nowhere else in his works does he talk about Jesus or Christianity. He's clearly a loyal Jew. So the fact that he would call him the Christ, that stands out, as he couldn't have said that. The other thing is there's a church father named Origen who we know read and commented on Josephus, and he never mentions this passage. But a century later, another Christian bishop, Eusebius, does mention it. See, so that's an example where the first commentator didn't see this, apparently. Somehow he missed it, but a later person did. So really it was inserted between that time, probably in the early 4th century. So
that makes a lot of sense.
That's one historical mention of Jesus. It's not reliable. The other big mention is from a Roman historian named Tacitus. So Tacitus was a 2nd century Roman historian. He wrote a work called the Annals, which is about the history of 1st century Rome. And when he's writing about the Emperor Nero and the fire of Rome, he has this famous passage where he says, there was this fire in Rome, and then people blamed Nero, and then Nero, to deflect blame from himself, decided to blame the Christians. In order to explain this, he says, Christus was executed by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. And then he goes on. So this is supposedly a mention of Christ from a non-biased Roman source. But this is probably interpolated too, because Tacitus, he knew his history very well, and he calls Pontius Pilate procurator when he was really a prefect. Also, nobody else mentions this passage or this persecution until the 5th century. So even Eusebius in the 4th century doesn't mention this, and no other Roman historian mentions this. So it's very suspect.
Sounds sus. It does.
Even if we grant that both of these are valid or not interpolations, that's still only 2 mentions about Jesus outside the Bible, and from people who couldn't have been eyewitnesses.
Oh yeah.
So we have literally no eyewitness testimony of Jesus, and that includes the Bible. Nobody who walked with Jesus and left a report.
That's right. Oh God, there we go, guys.
That's all we have.
There we go again. Chris blowing my mind.
I was just gonna say the same thing. Mind blown.
my God. I mean, we've said that before. We've said it was like Jesus wasn't there when the Bible was being put together. We've said that before, but it's like to actually get the perspective as to why that actually makes sense. It mind blown. Okay. Anyways, all right. More, Chris. More, please.
Both those mentions of Jesus are suspect, but even if you grant that's very little to go, it's very threadbare, and these people obviously didn't know Jesus themselves, and they couldn't have been witnesses. So when you turn to the Bible, now I'm gonna blow your mind. So you think of the New Testament, right?
Yeah.
The New Testament begins with the Gospels, and then it has a bunch of letters, right?
Mm-hmm.
These letters are supposedly written by Paul and the other apostles, and they're supposedly. So the way it's set up is like it begins with the Gospels, which is like the biography of Jesus, and it's about Jesus' life and what he was saying and doing early first century. And then the rest of the New Testament is supposed to be what the apostles were writing and doing subsequent to that, right? So after Jesus died and rose again, they went out and they were writing these letters and preaching these things, and that's how the religion grew. That's how it's presented. But really, the Gospels were the last part of the New Testament that was written. How do we know that the Gospels were written last, not first? In no part of the rest of the New Testament, in the letters of Paul, the letters of Peter, James, whatever, in none of those books do they quote the Gospels.
Huh.
So think about it. Imagine you are the disciple of Jesus and you believe he's the Son of God. You think he's the real deal, he's changing the world. And like maybe you don't have the written text of the gospel, but you've heard about it from word of mouth, or you were an eyewitness or whatever. Stuff he did and said. If you were telling people about that, wouldn't you repeat it?
Yeah.
Wouldn't you like not miss any opportunity to tell people?
Yeah.
Like, wouldn't you say, Jesus, he walked on water. He multiplied the loaves. He said, blessed are the peacemakers. Wouldn't you say those things? We never hear any of that in the rest of the New Testament. There's no mention of the walking on water, no mention of the loaves and fishes, no mention of the famous quotes to Jesus. You won't find them in any of the letters of Paul or Peter or James or John. Why wouldn't they mention them unless they hadn't been written yet?
Yup. Yup. Oh my God. Oh, that's so wild. That makes so much sense. Oh my God, that's so that I can't even I have no words. That makes so much sense, and I can't even think about the Gospels the same way anymore.
I mean, even if they weren't written, you would expect to at least see a paraphrase, like somebody saying in their own words.
Someone would have to mention it in the first place, because this is Jesus's PR team, supposedly.
Right, exactly.
So like this is like the first thing that you would do. Let's say, for example, someone was representing me. The first thing that their job is to spread the word as to why I should be hired to do something, right? And they will say everything that I'm good at. It's like a resume. Like you're going to say everything that you have to say to make you credible, right? And that's not what happened. That's so interesting. Oh my goodness, love that.
So, and it gets worse than that. So after
I believe it.
So after the first century, we have a series of Christian authors. One of them is named Justin Martyr. He lived mid-2nd century. Some others, and we have writings from them too, which are important historically. And they don't quote the Gospels either. They talk about Jesus. The things they talk about, they believe in Jesus and they believe in the resurrection. They talk about the resurrection a lot. And they believe that Jesus rose from the dead and that there will be another resurrection. And that's what they talk about. But they don't talk about like the little things he said or like the miracles. They just pass over that. There is no mention of the words Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John until a guy named Bishop Irenaeus of Lyon. He was a bishop in southern France. And he's writing at the end of the 2nd century, about the year 190. And he's writing a book refuting the writings of the Gnostics, arguing against them. And that is the first historical mention we have of the words that there are 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So the first person we have mentioning them is at the end of the 2nd century, which means they couldn't have been written or completed much before then. So Jesus has supposedly lived early 1st century, and we don't hear anything about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John until the end of the 2nd century.
Oh yeah. Oh my God.
So it's almost 200-year gap.
And they were definitely not eyewitnesses. They were definitely not there. Oh my God. Okay.
And worse yet, Irenaeus, who was the first person to say there are 4 Gospels and these are them, he also apparently believed that Jesus lived to be an old man. And he condemns as heresy the idea that Jesus died in his 30s. So he apparently hadn't read these Gospels yet, even though he lists the names. So they probably weren't even finished yet.
I was like, they didn't exist?
They were in production.
Oh, right. Or yeah, they were being written.
So actually, some of the Gnostic Gospels predate our Gospels. And a lot of the material, what I think happened is that the official church, the Orthodox Church, knew they had to get their act together, and at the end of the 2nd century, and they took the best of what was out there, including some of the Gnostic Gospels, some older materials, and they compiled them together around the end of the 2nd century, and that became the Gospels we have.
So they just took bits and pieces of everything, put it together, and made it canon?
Yeah. I mean, the Gospels we have are composed from multiple sources. But we don't hear about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John until Irenaeus. He's the first person to name them. That's the end of the 2nd century. And again, they're never quoted or alluded to in the other books of the New Testament, or by the writers that came before Irenaeus.
So cherry picking's been going on since the beginning. It's been happening since the beginning.
If you had them, why wouldn't you quote them?
Yeah, 100%.
So the other guy we talk about is Paul, right? So Paul makes up the most of the rest of the New Testament. So Paul, he never quotes Jesus. And the one time he does quote him, it's a line which we don't find in the Gospels. But he does clearly believe in the crucifixion and resurrection. So that's the only piece of the story he has, that Jesus was crucified and he rose again. But it's not clear if he thinks this is a historical event or if this was some kind of like cosmic archetypal event. So if you go to, so one of the most important books in the New Testament, which I recommend everybody reads or becomes familiar with, just to understand the grapple of the history of it, is Paul's letter to Galatians. So if you open up to Galatians, this is like one that, so some of the Paul letters, people think they're also forged. Some of them, there are some, most scholars agree, are authentically written by Paul, but even those are full of interpolations. But this is one of them which most people agree it was, if anything was written by Paul, it was this one, Galatians, also 1 Corinthians. So in this, and the reason why I think it's authentic is because it's so weird and because it contradicts the other stuff so much that they couldn't have made this up. So if you go to Galatians chapter 1, verse 11, he says, "Brethren, I would have you know that the gospel which was preached by me is not man's gospel. For I did not receive it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came from a revelation of Jesus Christ." So he's saying what he's preaching, he didn't receive from any man, meaning he didn't know Jesus, he didn't receive it from Jesus, nor did he receive it from those who knew Jesus. Like, it wasn't taught to him. He says it came from revelation, meaning this is UPG. What he's teaching is a private revelation that he had. This is what he's saying. He's saying, I'm not getting this from tradition, I'm not getting it from the horse's mouth. This is a private revelation which was given to me by Jesus, who, for all we know, to him may just be a spiritual idea or a spiritual figure, not a historical man.
Yeah, yeah.
He says he's boasting, like, I received this from no man. This is the revelation I received from Jesus.
So what if Paul can do it, so can we. I'm just saying.
Right.
If I was being cynical, you would say, like, he's making it up.
Right.
He's full of shit.
Yeah. That's right.
If we don't want to be cynical, we can say, okay, he had some kind of UPG experience. But still, that UPG experience is not based on historical events. It's based on private revelation, right?
Yeah, 100%. But the thing about it is that when we talk about UPG, like UPG is one thing. I believe that UPG is important. So if, like, let's say for example, I did meet Paul, and Paul told me this thing, I probably would have thought he was fucking nuts. But I've also I've met a whole bunch of my friends who talk about their practice and tell me about the experiences they have, especially within channeling. It's also really, really, really easy for me to believe. I'm just like, yeah, you definitely had that experience. What are you talking about? So going back and forth, I don't know. It's difficult to discern. Depending, it really depends on who you're talking to. Because if I met Paul, I probably would have thought he was nuts. But then, like, if I'm talking to Ry and Ry tells me, I was like, I got a message from Jesus. I'm like, did you really? Tell me about it. Tell me all about it. You know what I mean? So it's like discernment is really, really important. I know the historical part of it is important, making sure, because the historical part of it is based in fact, and it's something that you can back up. UPG is not something that you can defend. It's based on your experiences, and we talk about that too. We believe that UPG is really important, and we base our practice and our experiences on it, and that's how we kind of advocate for what we do. And I always tell people, like, this is what happened to me, this is what I did. If the same thing happens to you, then great. If not, then fine, whatever. So it's kind of one of those things. But also at the same time, discernment is important, because it's like, did Paul make it up? It's the same thing. I was like, I'll go to bed. I was like, wow, what Ry just told me is incredible, but did Ry make it up? I always have that in my head. I do that with myself too. I was like, is this UPG me? Is this really happening? Or am I just making this up? It's like we have to also discern ourselves at the same time.
Not you gaslighting yourself.
I do it all the time. I'm such a victim of gaslighting, especially from myself. And also, my friends, who I hang out with. Those people gaslight me all the time. But yeah, it's a really interesting. But you're right, to kind of see it that way, saying like, okay, this is not from the horse's mouth, like you said. This is just based on an experience that I had, and here it is written down. Believe it. And that's a little. It's a little sus.
Yeah, so you can choose to believe him or not, just like you can choose to believe any other UPG. But the point is, he's not a witness, and he doesn't claim to be a witness. He doesn't seem to care whether or not he's a witness.
That's true.
To him, the UPG is more important. Which is interesting. Interesting, it's right there in the first page of Galatians. He's saying, I received this from no man. And he's kind of boasting of that. So he goes on. So he goes on a few verses later. So, but when he who had set me apart before I was born and called me through his grace was pleased to reveal his son to me, in order that I might preach among the Gentiles, I did not confer with flesh and blood. Meaning, when he got this call to preach the gospel, he did not even meet the other people who were busy with this. Didn't confer with them. Nor did I go to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away to Arabia and again to Damascus. Then after 3 years, I went to Jerusalem to visit Cephas. So here's another thing. This account he's giving contradicts what we read in the Acts of the Apostles. So the Acts of the Apostles kind of tells us about Paul's life and his journey, And the story we get there is contradicted by what we read here. But anyway, so after 3 years, I went to Jerusalem, and I remained of Cephas, who is supposedly Peter, and remained of him for 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. And then he goes on, so he says, and that was in parentheses, it says, in what I am writing to you before God, I do not lie. So this is something, if you read Paul's letters, he says this a lot. He says, I'm not lying. I'm not a liar. I do not lie. Like as if people were accusing him of lying, which is something you would do if you're going around saying, I had this private revelation from Jesus. Here's what he told me. People might accuse you of lying, right? And throughout the letter, if you hear this line, I do not lie, which kind of implies he is lying.
Yeah, which
Right.
it kind of implies that he's probably not being honest. Yeah.
That's hilarious.
So another important passage from Paul, so from 1 Corinthians. So this is another letter that's probably authentic by Paul. But here we have an example of interpolation, which I can show you. So 1 Corinthians chapter 15. This is so again, he never mentions like the walking on water. There's another part in Galatians. So somebody could say like, okay, they don't tell the story of Jesus because, you know, they assume you've already read the Gospels, or they assume you already know these things. That's why they don't say it. But that doesn't hold up, because even when they have an occasion to mention something, they don't. Like there's a passage in Galatians where he's talking about Jesus, and he says Jesus was born of a woman. Now, when he's saying that, like, why wouldn't he say he was born of a virgin? Like if that was part of the story, that this guy was born of a virgin, how could you miss an opportunity?
That was also one of the most important parts of his fucking story, is that his mother was a virgin. The Immaculate Conception is a huge part of Christianity.
But unless that idea didn't develop until later, right? So long after Paul was dead, which is the truth. So he wouldn't have thought to mention that because it wasn't part of the story yet. So when he talks about Jesus' birth, he just says he was born of a woman and he moves on. Whereas, you know, if anyone else is writing that, they'd be like, "Oh, but did you forget he was born of a virgin?" You know,
right.
Not a big deal, you know. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as the one untimely born, he appeared also to me." So did you catch the interpolation? So first he says he appeared to Cephas, who's Peter, and to the 12, who were the 12 apostles. Peter is one of the 12, so it's like, is it 12 plus 1? And then he says, then he appeared to 500 brothers. Then the next sentence, he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. He said that twice.
Oh yeah, he repeated himself.
He says first he appeared to Cephas and the 12. Then he appeared to James, who's an apostle, and all the apostles.
40. So that's what.
So he says he appeared to all the apostles twice in two different lines, back to back.
So really, it's almost 30 people.
So what scholars think is the original must be this. He appeared to James, then all the apostles, then to me. This bit about the 12 is a later mythologizing of the story. The idea that there are only 12 apostles, the number 12 is symbolic, right? That's a mythological idea. 12 tribes of Israel, 12 zodiac signs. That idea developed later. And somebody inserted that along with Cephas, who's Peter, because they wanted to put Peter as the most important apostle. Because later he becomes more important to the founding of Rome, the Roman Church. And then this bit about the 500 brethren he appeared to, that is mentioned nowhere else. Like, why, if Jesus appeared to 500 brethren at once, why wouldn't we hear that in the Gospels? Why does no other writer mention that in the Scriptures? Nobody else mentions it after the Scriptures. None of the church fathers. There's nowhere in literature do you find this mention that Jesus appeared to 500 brethren at once, resurrected. This is the only time. Like if that happens, how could you not mention it? How could we not see evidence of it elsewhere? Yeah. Unless this was interpolated by a later writer who was like, we need to beef up this story a little bit. Let's just throw this in there. So this thing about James, though, is interesting. So Paul is very obsessed with James. And he calls James the brother of Jesus. And if there's anything that tells me that Jesus was based on a historical person, it's this. Because nobody would make that up. Like, if he's going around talking about this person, and when you read Paul, it becomes clear that he's jealous of James, and that James holds a lot of authority in the early church. Which he always talks about James. Paul always talks about James and his authority trumping his own authority and trumping the authority of Peter and others. which contradicts what we see in the Gospels. So the Gospels is always Peter is the main guy, right? So that's a later story, which later rewriting of the truth, whereas the truth was early on, James was very important. Also, he calls him the brother of the Lord, so clearly he hasn't heard this Virgin Mary idea yet. He never mentions Mary either, by the way. So, also this story that is narrated, it contradicts what we hear in the Gospels, right? Because in the Gospels, it's always Mary Magdalene who Jesus appears to first. Sometimes it's Mary Magdalene by herself, sometimes she's with other women. That's how the story always goes in the four Gospels, right? He appears to her first. Here he's saying he appears to James first. There's no mention of James in the Gospels, notice. Because James has been written out of the Gospels. But in Paul, James is very prominent. So, like I was saying earlier, if there was a Jesus, the Jesus we're getting is not only an exaggeration and an untruth, but actually an inversion of the real person. And we know this because we know historically there was a messianic movement in first century Palestine. And we know this because their literature has been discovered, and it's called the Dead Sea Scrolls. So before the 20th century, if you had said, like, what was the literature of first century messianism? And people would say, oh, it's the New Testament. But then in I think it was 1947, there was a shepherd boy walking along the Dead Sea, and he threw a rock in a cave, and he heard a sound of breaking jar. And he said, what was that? And he goes up into the cave, and he finds all these old jars filled with scrolls, which have been sitting there for 18 centuries, undiscovered. And these were the Dead Sea Scrolls. So what had happened is, in the years 66 to 73, there was a war between Rome and the people of Judah, of Palestine. And this war is mostly forgotten, but it was an incredibly important event. It's estimated 1 million people died. The temple, the second temple, which was the most important site in Judaism, was destroyed. And, if you go to Jerusalem today, there's the Wailing Wall, which Jews still pray at, right? The Wailing Wall is the only surviving wall of that temple, which was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. So, so why was there this war? There was a war because there was a movement of Jews at the time. It wasn't all Jews, but there was a sect of Jews who were messianic, and they believed that there was going to be a Messiah coming who would defeat the Romans and lead them to victory. And their belief in this led them to rebel against the Romans and start this war, which ended in the total destruction of Jerusalem and the suppression of the Jewish people. After the war, the Romans not only crucified thousands of people, but they also collected all their documents and burned them and destroyed them. So that's why we have no literature from this period, except for Josephus in the New Testament, until we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that's why it was a huge discovery. The reason why the scrolls were hidden in a cave and nobody came back for them was because it's kind of eerie, right? It's eerie because nobody came back for them. Why? Because they were all killed or enslaved by the Romans. So when you read
oh my God.
That's why they were hidden. They were hidden to protect them from the Romans who were destroying the documents, right? And nobody ever came back because there was nobody.
They're all dead.
Dead or enslaved, yeah. So when you read the Dead Sea Scrolls,
my God,
it's interesting because they talk about some of the same passages which are mentioned in the New Testament. They're also interested in these same, like a lot of Isaiah, right, which is quoted a lot in the New Testament. They're interested in some of these same ideas, but their interpretation is totally different. It's a totally different take. So, whereas Jesus is peaceful, turn the other cheek, love your enemy, Dead Sea Scrolls is not like that. They are not peaceful. It's very militant, very anti-Roman, very anti-foreigner. Jesus, sat with tax collectors and prostitutes. Not these guys. No. They're anti-fornication, anti-Rome and tax collector, they're very purist, anti-foreigner, and they were very much into purifying themselves. What they would do is they would bathe daily, do these ritual baths, because they thought in the war against Rome they needed the help of the angels, and angels can't be with people who are dirty, so they would bathe daily. So it's the kind of the John the Baptist idea. That's where this comes from. They were these daily bathers, and some of them were vegetarians, and they observed a very strict rule of life. So they were hardcore. And these people were the ones who led the rebellion against Rome, which failed terribly. So, and James, it's believed that James was part of this community. So when he would talk about who were the early Christians, who were the people who were, they wouldn't call themselves Christians, but who were the people who were Jewish in first century Palestine, who were messianists and interested in the same literature, it was the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, who were nothing like the Jesus we see in Scripture. Which leads to an interesting question. Why is Jesus that way, right? Why is everything we read in the New Testament kind of like the flip side and version of what we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls? It's almost like it was written by somebody else for a different purpose.
I just feel like Oprah, that gif of Oprah, where it's like, so what is the truth?
So, I mean, this is one theory I've become partial to, but once
I
you
was about
see
to
it,
say, I was about to say, I was like, I want to hear what Chris believes. Like, I want to see what they feel, what he feels is canon. But go ahead.
so in the first century, there were these people who were, a group of Jews who were very pure and who were interested in the scriptures and interpreting them and expecting the Messiah and expecting a war against Rome. So they would say things like, they wouldn't say love your enemies, they would command you to hate the sons of the pit. The sons of the pit were Romans, right? You were commanded to hate them. So it's very much not like the New Testament. And they led this messianic disturbance, which led to this war, which killed 1 million people, which led to the Romans destroying the temple. And then there was another war in the year 130, another messianic uprising, and the Romans put that down again, after which the Jews weren't even allowed to go back to Jerusalem. They banished them. So this was a problem that kept reoccurring. It wasn't just in the Holy Land, it was also in Alexandria. There were messianic disturbances in the Greek cities. So this is a real problem for the Romans, right? So if you have this war and you defeat them and you don't want it to happen again, and you know the cause of the war is that these Jews believe a Messiah is coming, what do? You make your own Messiah. And you take their scriptures and you use them to prove your Messiah, and you put in his mouth statements which are peace-loving, pro-Roman, pro-tax collector, pro-foreigner, and you say, this is the Messiah. If you want to be a messianist, go this way. Oh, and since you're Roman, you also make him very much like a pagan demigod, right? So the Romans like those stories about virgin births. Jews would never invent a story about a virgin birth, they would, and then Jews would never worship a man as God. That's a very un-Jewish idea. It's a very pagan idea to worship a man as God. Right. It's very pagan. That's why there's so many parallels to Jesus to pagan myths. There are many, many stories in the Greek world about men who are heroes, and they rise to such a level of heroism they become like the gods, right? And they ascend to heaven, like Hercules, Romulus. There are many stories like this, which are very similar to Jesus. So to the Roman mind, this is a very familiar idea, that you can worship a man as God, or that you can have a man who's like adopted by the gods, right? But to the Jews, they would never accept that. To the Jews, is antithetical, that you would worship a man as God, or that you would have a virgin birth or anything like that.
It's like to take someone that was a radical and make them more digestible, so that to garner a following. That's really interesting.
Right. So think about when America was fighting in Afghanistan, right? they had a religious problem where there were some Muslims who had a very strict interpretation of Islam, and that was causing conflict, right, with American military interests. So one of the, besides using arms, there was also a political outreach which would say, no, Islam is peaceful. Islam is peace. This is, go this way. The U.S. government would try to push this idea, like, no, the true Muslim likes America. The true Muslim is peaceful. In the same way, the Romans of this time would say, no, the true Jew is a follower of Jesus, who is peaceful, loves his enemies, says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Which was totally antithetical to the idea of the time of what we read in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is hate your enemy, hate the sons of the pit, never compromise.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So the disturbing reality is that, so the other thing is, like I said, the Romans after this war, they destroyed all the documents. Nothing was allowed to circulate except what the Romans approved, which is why the only source we had was Josephus, because Josephus was a Jew who went over to the Romans. So he was an official historian for the Roman emperors, which is why his history was the only one that was remembered. We only know the story from the Romans' perspective. We didn't get a Jewish perspective of the story until we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we weren't supposed to find because they were hidden in a cave, and nobody ever came back from. So what the Romans wanted you to know was what was written in the Josephus and what's written in the New Testament.
Wow.
So yes, the New Testament was written by, or compiled by, the Romans. Which is why there's so much pro-Roman stuff in the New Testament. So there's one scene, it's a famous scene in Matthew, it's in all the Gospels, but especially in Matthew chapter 8, verses 5 through 13. Jesus encounters the centurion, right? And the centurion comes out to him and he says, Jesus, my slave, he's sick, can you heal him? And Jesus is like, okay, I'll come heal him. And the centurion's like, no, you're not, I'm not worthy that you should come under my roof, which is still quoted in the Roman Catholic Church, right? I'm not worthy that you should come under my roof, but just say the word and he'll be healed. You know that scene? You know the scene I'm referring to?
I think so, yeah.
So Jesus is walking with his disciples. He encounters this Roman centurion who is the Roman occupying force. The cause of this agitation among the Jews, right, is that they have these occupying Romans forcing them to pay taxes. And the Romans had put in power the Herodian family, the family of Herod. And they were like semi-Jews, they weren't really observant. And the granddaughters of Herod were famous for their affairs and their fornications. Mm-hmm. And this was a huge agitation to these purist Jews who are writing the Dead Sea Scrolls. So in this passage, the centurion asked Jesus to heal his slave, and Jesus is like, yeah, I'll do it. And then the centurion's like, no, I'm not worthy that you should come under my roof. We'll only say the word and then he'll be healed, because he gives this whole explanation about how authority works. And then Jesus turns to his disciples and he says, I've never seen faith like this, never in Israel. It's really astounding, like audacious passage. The way to see how audacious it is, it would be like, imagine there is a popular imam in Afghanistan, and he's walking around, and an American soldier comes up to him and he's like, hey, can you heal my friend? And then the imam says to his fellow Muslims, I've never seen faith like this in Islam.
Mm-hmm.
An American soldier who's not even Muslim.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like it'd be one thing if he was like, oh, this guy's all right. We should be nice to these people. They're different from us, but they're all right.
Mm-hmm.
But no, he goes further than that. He says that the faith of the centurion excels the faith of all the loyal Jews. And this guy's not even a Jew. Yeah. See how outrageous that is?
Yeah.
Not only would that never happen.
It's the absolute audacity. Yeah.
It would never happen in a million years. Even if there was a guy who was like, oh, we should be more peaceful toward these people, like that you can see. But to say that this guy who's not a Jew, his faith excels the faith of any other Jew.
Right.
It's really audacious and outrageous. Who could have written that except for the Romans, who were
extremely presumptuous, very brazen. Yeah, absolutely.
And the other thing we have to talk about here is the history of anti-Semitism and how that's connected to the New Testament.
Yeah.
So if you read the New Testament, it's very anti-Jewish all throughout. Like, it couldn't have been written by Jews.
Mm-hmm.
The most famous part is so at the crucifixion, Pontius Pilate is going to put him to death, but it's very clear in the story that it was the Sanhedrin, it was the Jews conspiring to put Jesus to death. It's really their fault, right?
Right.
And there's even this scene when Pontius Pilate, he clearly doesn't want to condemn Jesus. He's like, no, like, this guy's innocent. Like, I don't want to. But they're forcing his hand, right? And then he literally washes his hands of the Jesus' blood. So it's literally exonerating the Roman government of this man's death, right? Right in the story. And in Matthew, you even get this scene where the Jewish crowd, they shout out that his blood be on our hands and on the hands of our children. And this line has, led to the centuries of anti-Semitism from the Christian world against the Jews, which is still very much a reality. Like, you look at Mel Gibson or Kanye or whatever, anybody who reads the New Testament, it's hard not to come away with this idea that the Jews are bad and that they killed their own savior. Because that's the story. That's the story we're told, which couldn't have been told by Jews, but could have been written by anti-Semitic Romans in the aftermath of this war.
Yeah. It's a lot of that's the thing. It's like the information. It's a lot of unpacking to do, especially when you know that this is historical, and this is not just folklore, as something which is something that we've become so conditioned and so conditioned to be comfortable with is folklore and just accepting it as canon. So something that I want to ask the two of you actually is, with the information that Chris, that you know, and then Ry, with the information that you now know, how do you navigate your spiritual practice the way that you spiritually see Jesus and that figure, that spirit, and kind of, I don't know, separate it from the historical aspect of Jesus? Because I know that there's validity in both, but where do you draw the line? Because now I'm trying to kind of figure that out. I'm trying to figure out where I lie. Because here's the thing. In the last 2 years, my practice has not been, in the last 3 years, my practice has not really been Jesus-centered. It's not really based on Christ. It's based on my own feelings. It's based on my own spiritual, my own UPG. So now, like, looking at just like thinking about the historical aspects and things that Chris has talked about tonight, I'm trying to figure out how to navigate this in regards to my practice. Because, like, where do we lie now? Like, how do you, Chris, for example, how do you navigate this as someone who's a theologian and someone who practices Christianity in some aspects? How do you navigate that?
Well, what somebody might say is, they might dismiss all this, say, I don't care about your arguments because I feel Jesus in my heart, right? They'll say, I don't care about this history. Like, I pray to Jesus, I feel him in my heart. And I don't deny that. I think that's true. The thing is, that was true of many other religions in the past too. The people they pray to, these are gods we don't believe in anymore, or religions which have come and gone. Like in ancient Egypt, they prayed to their gods, and they must have felt them in their heart too, right? And believed in them, but we don't believe in those gods. So there must be another explanation for why this happens. And I think it's archetypal. There's some archetypal energy which is out there, and there are different deities which you can say occupy or fit the bill of that energy. Jesus is one of them. I think when you look at Jesus and the way he is presented, it's really very identical to the way the Archangel Michael is presented, of this protector figure who defeats demons, this kind of masculine energy, kind of heart-centered energy, right? So I guess one way to say is that this is an archetype and an energy which is out there, and one of the faces of this energy is the man we call Jesus, which doesn't have to have, and in fact does not have any connection to a historical person.
That's right. That's right.
It's something. Archetypes are not historical; they're unhistorical, right? They're
Right.
you might believe they happened in another realm, or you might believe they're psychological. Either way, it's not something based on historical events. It's based on an energy or a frame of mind that you slip into.
Yeah, no, it's a spirit that we call Jesus. I mean, it's something that Jesus, I don't know if Jesus would call, that spirit would call themselves Jesus, but it is a spirit. Maybe that spirit is different for everybody. I know it's now I'm just kind of I'm trying to wrap my brain around it. Right? What do you think? I'm trying to get perspective here. Right, what do you think?
The wheels are still turning in my brain, but I think I'm along the lines of what Chris was just saying, of like just like the energy of it all. Like it makes me think of the occult concept of like egregores, and how just like when multiple people believe in like something, it does in fact like become real in a certain sense. And I mean, with so many people believing in this
collective
spiritual
belief,
Jesus, the collective belief of Christ is Jesus Christ, like he exists in some way, maybe not in the historical way, but is there as like an energy, as the field or whatever the fuck. I mean, because my practice is like yours, Vogue. It's not Jesus centered. I've hardly ever had, I don't think I've ever had any UPG in regards to like Christ. It's always been like some saints here and there, or angels or whatever, but like never Christ himself. But yeah,
100%.
this is definitely just like blown my mind in terms of like,
I think if anything, for people who are folk practitioners like yourselves, it helps make sense, right, of why different saints or angels can play this role just as easily for you as the idea of Jesus, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was about to say, because okay, so I'm working with Saint Raphael when I go to work, but that's all based on how I feel and how I practice and how I communicate with whatever spirit that is, because no one showed me a textbook on the history of Saint Raphael as a spirit. Like that doesn't fucking exist. Like as in like, this is the spirit that exists, and what they look like, and what they said, and what they do, and it's based on other people's experiences. So it's the same. I mean, I understand the historical context, and I know the historical context is very important, especially with how humankind and how the community has used it to influence the way that we live our lives now. Like that's important. And how the dogma and how the scripture has been manipulated to influence the spirituality and how people act and how people use the religion. But then like, as like exactly what Chris said, like us as folk practitioners, we have a different relationship with spirituality. We have a different relationship with religion. We have a different relationship with how we devote ourselves to these spirits. We understand it differently, because it's something that we cultivated ourselves. It's not something that was cultivated and taught in a church. So it's just interesting to get the perspective as to the person who actually existed, and the person that I pray to, or the beings that I pray to, or the beings that many people pray to. It's very interesting, and this is actually giving me so much more perspective in regards to how I see Jesus, how I see Jesus in my own practice, and then also how I see Jesus, how other people see Jesus. So this is interesting. I like this because it's making me think really hard about just about who he is. And this is also really interesting because we actually haven't had a conversation about Christ yet on this podcast. And I think the reason why is because we don't really know. I mean, I already said that Ry and I don't really have a close relationship with Christ as we do with our other spirits. So I don't know, it's interesting to unpack this information, because I'm kind of comparing and contrasting it with how I've always seen Jesus, how I was conditioned to grow up to see Jesus,
Right. So to a folk practitioner, the historical Jesus, it doesn't matter to you so much. Like, you can take it or leave it, right? Because you're comfortable working with the archetype if you want to work with that.
Absolutely.
Like, if there is no Jesus, no problem for you, because you can still, the archetype is still out there, and you can use it or not use it.
Right.
Whether or not it's historical or how historical it is, it doesn't really change anything for you.
That's true.
But the person who's invested in the idea of historical Jesus is the Orthodox believer, right? Why? Because if there is no historical Jesus, then the authority structure crumbles away.
Right.
So the Catholic Church, their whole basis, their whole claim to authority is that Jesus gave us his authority. Like, there was a historical man, and he gave the keys to Peter, and Peter was our founder. So, like, there's this line of transmission from one historical person to another upon which they base their authority and upon which they base their claim to say, we speak for Jesus. So to them, the historicity of Jesus really matters. They have an invested stake in it.
Right.
He has to be real. Even they can say, like, oh, some of this is exaggerated, some of this is lost in translation. But they have to say he was a real historical man. Otherwise, their whole edifice of authority crumbles.
Right. Their credibility goes away if they don't believe that Jesus actually existed. That makes a lot of sense. Yep. Their entire base of existence, why they exist, like their reason for being here, and the reason why they existed would crumble away. It's not even just their authority. It's the reason why they spoke would crumble.
Right. Their whole claim is that Jesus gave us this mandate to preach the gospel to the world, and that's what we're doing here. But if you're a folk practitioner, then you're disengaging with the archetype. It doesn't matter if that has any historical basis or not.
Whether it was actually attached to a physical person or not. Yeah. Ry, you good?
Yeah, no, I'm like dissociating. So I'm like, fuck, I just want
Me too.
I just want the whole institution to crumble. Like, it's just,
I know. Leave it to Chris to just like put us in like this existential crisis. But yeah, no, that's absolutely fascinating. That is really, really fascinating.
So again, I go saying, for my example of the Big Lebowski, if there was a dude, if there was a Jesus, he wasn't like the portrait we've received. He was like these Dead Sea Scroll people, who was a messianist, who was, leading a violent uprising against Rome, which would explain why he was crucified, right? That makes sense of that part of the story. And there were Jewish, quote unquote Jewish Christians who were part of this original group who lasted several centuries. They were called the Ebionites. So Ebionite comes from a Hebrew word for the poor. So when you hear, so there are certain parts of the New Testament which might have some authentic connection to these people, and there are certain parts of the Gospel of Matthew, the letter of James, and the book of Revelation. Those are probably the most Jewish parts of the New Testament. But this was very anti-Pauline. It wasn't like Paul's message, because Paul's message was, you don't need the law, you don't need circumcision. We're doing our own thing now, which is a very un-Jewish, very anti-Jewish message. And the Gospels really, they put Paul's theology in narrative form, basically. They put Paul's theology in the mouth of this literary character who they're calling Jesus, who was just telling us the same things Paul said. But the Ebionites, they continued living and teaching for a few centuries around the area of Palestine. And they called themselves the poor. They were like the dispossessed of the land. They weren't the rich. And like, if you read, there's this part at the end of the letter of James where he's denouncing the rich, and it's very apocalyptic. And that sounds a lot like the Dead Sea Scrolls. Like, that kind of rhetoric is very similar. These were the poor people. They didn't like the Romans. They didn't like the Herodians, who were allied to the Romans. James, it is said, by the way, we have more extra biblical evidence for James's life than we do for Jesus. So James, it is said, he practiced the commandment, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And the way they interpreted that to mean was that you had to be poor, because you couldn't love your neighbor as yourself if there was any economic distinction between you. That's how they interpreted it. So that meant you couldn't own property. That's why they were called the poor, the Ebionites. And apparently we have from other sources that the Ebionites, they had something called the Gospel of the Hebrews, which is now lost, but it's believed that some of it was similar to the Gospel of Matthew. And when you read, there are certain parts in the Gospel of Matthew where Jesus is preaching a very anti-Paul message, where he's saying, like, your righteousness must exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, and that you have to keep the law. You know, there's parts that contradict the other parts. And those are the parts that are probably from the Ebionites. And so once Rome took over, and once Christianity became the official religion of Rome, these Ebionites they were suppressed more and more. So they didn't worship Jesus as God; they saw Jesus as a prophet. Because again, this idea of Jesus, of a man God, is very anti-Jewish. The man God idea is very Greek, very pagan. Jews would never come up with that idea. And these Ebionites,
I'm so
Jewish
sorry.
Christians.
The idea of man god just makes me laugh because it sounds like man child. It's like it just sounds so. It sounds so. I don't know. The word escapes me, but it sounds so ridiculous, like man god. Which I know that, like, okay, there are folks who venerate demigods. Like, I'm not going to say that that's, but when you say man god, it makes me so. It makes, because that's what Jesus was. Jesus was a man god. He was man god, man plus god, man god. It's just so ridiculous. Anyways, continue.
So again, that's a very pagan idea. Jews would never think of this, they would never think of worshiping a man. But they honored Jesus as a prophet, a very important prophet, the Ebionites. But as Christianity became the official religion and they were suppressed more and more, they were eventually pushed outside of the empire and went into exile. And they went into Arabia, and their descent, it is believed, one theory, their descendants eventually became the people who started Islam. And in Islam, Jesus is a prophet. And a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls is very similar to the language of Islam. And in fact, there are some passages commented in the Dead Sea Scrolls that's word for word in the Quran. So this, if you want to know what the first Christians were like, they were kind of like Muslims. That was authentic Palestinian Christianity, which makes sense, right? But what we've received and inherited is this pagan Roman idea, which is an inversion of that, which took the name of Jesus and took some of these scriptures and used them for a totally different purpose.
Try telling a Republican that. Tell a Republican that the original Christians were actually Muslim.
I'm not saying they're exactly the same, but there was more continuity.
For sure. They're not gonna, Chris, they're not gonna care about the difference. They don't care about semantics. We both know this.
There was a lot of continuity between these Dead Sea Scroll people in the first century messianists and what would develop 6 centuries later in Arabia, which became Islam.
Fascinating.
And they still revere Jesus as a prophet, the second most important prophet after Muhammad.
So are we saying that the parallels are kind of suggesting that the Muslims got it right?
They got some things right, yeah. More like
see, that's what I'm saying. The parallels are important because especially within the Christian umbrella of religion, the parallels are important. That's the reason why I joked about telling the conservative Christians about why the original or early Christians would have seemed more Muslim, or their practice would have seemed more, or their tenets or their beliefs would have seemed more Muslim, because there are parallels, and the parallels actually point to truth, and they point to history. So this is what the institutionalized body has done, is gatekeep that information to keep people blind, so they don't see the parallels and bring forth things like, I don't know, xenophobia, things like that. Just a little thing like that. So I mean, this information is important because the parallels were so much more alike than you think.
Okay, I'm gonna just be Buddhist now.
Well, there goes the podcast. Oh my goodness, fascinating. Chris, is there anything else that you would be happy to divulge to us before we cap off this episode?
Well, do you have any more questions? Or?
Ry, do you have any questions?
I have one like percolating in my mind. I just want to form before I actually verbalize it. I guess, like, how did learning all of this affect your own practice? I mean, I know we touched on like energies, archetypes, and whatnot, but as far as you're willing to share about your personal practice, like, did this cause like a major shift in just how you viewed Christianity, Catholicism, and whatever it is that you kind of previously may have had a foundation in?
When I first heard this idea that the Roman government may have had a hand in this, it was like so many things clicked in my mind, right? Because I knew these scriptures pretty well, and it's like I'd never seen it before. But once you see it, it's like so much made sense. Like the whole passage about the centurion, so many other things Jesus says. Like it never made sense to me why, like, the story is, you know, the God chose the Jews as the chosen people, and he gave them this law, and his plan was eventually to bring forth a son out of them to like save the world, right? But then, like, you read the New Testament, and it's so anti-Jewish, and it's like they're just throwing out the Torah, they're just throwing it out, and I was like, why would God do that? You know, like, that's so weird. Like, why would he like set these people up for like this one idea, and, like, and then pull the rug from under them?
Right. Yeah,
it's kind of a weird thing for God to do. But it makes total sense now that it wasn't written by them.
But it's also not the weirdest thing God has done. So let's just put that out there. Yeah.
But this is when I was, you know, believing and practicing. I was like,
right.
You know, I don't get it. Like, so it was just like a huge like aha moment. And
did this play a part in you leaving seminary by any chance? I'm just
curious.
No,
I had never heard this idea when I was seminary.
Oh, okay. Well, how could you? They would never give you that information.
No, they would not. So, you know, in the history of the Catholic Church, there's been a lot of anti-Semitism and persecution of the Jews. And then they really culminated in the Holocaust. And after the Holocaust, there was kind of some soul searching and pulling back from that. And ever since then, you know, the official line is like, no, the Jews didn't kill Jesus. It was the Romans. And that's been the take, which is more often pushed since World War II, because, you know, the church had to reckon with, you know, how did we have a hand in this horror? You know, were we partly responsible for this? So since then, again, movies and Hollywood, it's usually like the Romans who are the bad guys. But if you go back and read the actual text, it's very clear that the Jews are the bad guys, and the Romans are exonerated at every turn. So it's still a problem as far as that we have, you know, the most printed book in the world is anti-Semitic.
Oh, yeah.
And that's why we have all these problems. The other thing is, what was I going to say? So the other interesting thing is about Paul. So Paul's idea was, so the Jews and the Muslims, they have this in common, is that it's not so much what you believe that matters as what you do. Like, to be a Jew means to keep the Torah. It means you have to, what you believe isn't so important as what you do. Like, if you keep the law, you know, you circumcise, you keep kosher, you do these various things, then you're a Jew. That's what constitutes being a good Jew. In Islam, it's keeping the 5 pillars and stuff like that. They also have faith. But what Paul introduced was this idea of faith alone.
Mm-hmm.
It's not what you do that matters, is what you believe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that was really a novel idea in the history of religion. It's very strange. It's like he's saying, it's like the law doesn't matter. It's just faith in Jesus that saves you.
I was about to say, it sounds like a cop-out, but anyways.
That was his gospel that he says he received from no man. That was his UPG.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
this idea that
He received from no man. I can't
I'm not
handle it.
lying, guys. I'm not lying. I swear
I'm
it's
not
true.
lying. Yeah. Oh my god. But yeah, no, it sounds like a cop out, right? It's like just as long as you believe, you're good. You're
That
fine.
sounded lazy.
But if you
Yeah.
read the letter of James, which I said I don't believe it was really written by James, but it may have some roots in Jamesian traditions and like authentic Jewish Christian traditions. He has a whole passage where he contradicts that. He says, "What does it profit, my brethren, if a man says he has faith but not works? Can his faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and in lack of daily food, and one of you says to him, 'Go in peace, be warmed and filled,' without giving them the things needed for the body, what does it profit? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead." He says, "You believe that God is one. You do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. Was not Abraham, our father, justified by works when he offered his son Isaac upon the altar? You see that faith was active along with works, and faith was completed by works. You see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone." So this is, a classic example of one part of the New Testament contradicting another part.
Fuck Paul.
And it's because it comes from two different traditions,
Yeah.
which are pieced together.
Yeah.
And there were many different sources and traditions pieced together, which is why you get these discrepancies.
Right. Right. It's a book of contradictions. That's why I always implore our folks, the people who listen to our podcast, is that we are not, the Bible is just a book, and it's very, very, I mean, I'm dumbing it down, and I'm pretty sure that Chris can definitely be much more eloquent in what I'm about to say. But the book is a book, and that's all it is. It's a book. So, and the reason why we have so many problems in this world is because folks believe that this book is supposed to be, first of all, was written by the hand of God. That's the biggest thing. Everyone needs to relax, and if you believe that this book was written by the hand of God, then we're in trouble. I mean, we are in trouble. But at the same time, it's like the book is a book, and it needs to be discerned. There are things that you can take, and there are things that you can leave, and there are more things that you should leave. There are good things in it that you should definitely carry with you and carry in with your life, and make it so that you make this world a better place. But if there's something in this book that encourages you not to be a better person, then it's good to occlude that from your practice. And this kind of just gives a little bit more perspective into why this book needs to be discerned. Like, even with books that are written by one author, are they though? Some of them are not. There are these things called ghost authors that people have, and we just don't know what. And there are editors, and there are people who, there are people, it's peer reviewed. Like, I'm peer reviewing a friend's book right now, and I'm adding my notes, and I'm telling us, like, maybe you should include this, which they did. So it's like there are different hands in the pot, and sometimes the soup doesn't taste the same if there are different hands in the pot. So we just need to make sure that you use your critical thinking skills, take the perspective that is being given to you on this podcast through all of the episodes that we've put out there. Ry's perspective, my perspective, Chris's perspective, anyone that you follow online, the people that the priest that delivers a sermon when you go to church, everything. Take what the perspective is giving you and see how it fits. And if it's making you anxious, depressed, or angry, or sad, or not a good person, then maybe it's a good idea to maybe not include that in your daily life.
One other thing.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. One other thing I want to say. So, another thing that's made me realize or look at differently was a lot of these passages where Jesus is promoting pacifism, right? Like he says, turn the other cheek. And there's a famous line where he says, go the extra mile. So that's actually referring to Roman soldiers could compel civilians to carry their equipment for a Roman mile. And they had these markers that would mark out the miles along the road. Like, they could just grab somebody off the street and be like, carry my shit for a mile. And And Jesus says, go the extra mile, meaning like if that happens to you, not only should you do it without complaint, but you should go another mile without being told. Right? So that's the famous line, go the extra mile. So
No thanks.
when you look at these, first century messianists, the Dead Sea Scrolls people, like I don't agree with them. Like they were very militant, and they believed what they believed, and I respect that. I don't agree with rebelling against Rome because I think suicide is stupid, and that was suicidal. So what they did was stupid because suicide is stupid. That being said, you gotta look at some of these lines in the New Testament and really wonder, like, if they were written by the conqueror, by the Romans, who not only slaughtered all these people and crucified thousands of them, and then they're writing lines like "turn the other cheek," who is that intended for? They're saying stop rebelling, turn the other cheek, go the extra mile.
Correct.
And when you realize that's coming from the mouth of the ruler, it makes you look at it differently. And of course, there's many passages in the New Testament which says, "Slaves, obey thy masters."
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's written in the Romans.
I say that all the time. It's that passage in Ephesians. I'm just like that's something that really bothers me that it's still fucking in there. But yeah, to be a slave of God is to be an obedient servant. Yeah.
It's really chilling when you realize that after the Jewish war, many of these Jews were enslaved and brought back to Rome, where they built the Colosseum. That's how the Colosseum got built. The Colosseum was built from Jewish money and plunder from this war, and built by Jewish slaves who were being preached at with these very words, "Obey thy masters." So when you realize that, it's very chilling. Like that this was being used to not only suppress violence, but to pacify these new slaves who were the spoils of this war.
Chris, what resources would you recommend for anyone who wants to dive further into these subjects or do their own research or just learn more? Anything you can recommend?
So there's a lot of mythicists out there. Dr. Vincent Price, Dr. Richard Carrier. You can find them on YouTube. There's a good YouTube channel and podcast called Myth Vision. About this Roman provenance idea, there's a book called Creating Christ by James Valiant, and there's a co-author, I forget, but if you look up Creating Christ, you'll find it, James Valiant. The main book, which is really scholarly and really good, is called James, the Brother of Jesus by Dr. Robert Eisenman. It's 1,000 pages. It's 1,000 pages, and he goes through the whole thing.
Chris, I can't even count to 1,000. What are you doing to me?
He's a Dead Sea Scroll scholar, and he goes through the scripture, and he kind of deconstructs it and reconstructs it and pieces it together, like who was who and what was really happening. And it's called James, the Brother of Jesus.
My goodness.
And there's another one which is more controversial called Caesar's Messiah by Joseph Atwill. And he goes through the connections between the works of Josephus and the Gospels, and how whoever was writing Josephus was also writing the Gospels. Like there was the same team of people behind both works. And that there are parts in the Gospels which are satirizing the War of the Jews and how it actually happened.
Okay. Well. Oh God.
So any of these people are good. There's also an older book called Forgery in Christianity by Joseph Wheels, I think his name is. It's an older book. It might be harder to find, but that's really good. Forgery in Christianity. But look up, Creating Christ, Myth Vision on YouTube or the podcast.
I'm definitely going to look up that podcast for sure.
Or again, these other mythicists like Dr. Price and Richard Carrier.
Perfect. Okay. All right. Red text listeners, when I told you that you should take out a piece of paper and a pen, do you think I'm joking now? This was definitely a very meaty, information dense episode, but I appreciate Chris coming on and talking. And I mean, I'm not gonna say it again, Chris. We love you, and we love the content that you create and the amount of information that is in that brain of yours. So anytime that we get a chance to pick it, is always a pleasure. And so Chris, this is a really good time for you to plug anything that you're doing, or just to plug whatever you have, any projects that you have, anything that you like to let people know, any services that you're providing. This is a good time to do it.
Thanks for having me. And look me up on Instagram or TikTok, Exegete, TAROTEXEGETE. And you can message me for readings or join my Patreon. You'll find the link on those pages from TikTok or Instagram. And I'm hoping to put together a course on teaching tarot soon. I haven't started yet.
Ooh.
That's the project. Maybe by December I'll be ready at the soonest. But
Ooh,
I cannot wait for that.
Ooh, okay. That sounds fun. I might want to do that. God, I can tell you, good for you, because I've been trying to write a fucking workshop for tarot for the last like 6 months, and I don't even know where the fuck to start. Anyways, God, that's a lot of information, but that sounds interesting. Okay. So with that said, thank you guys so much for being here with us, and thank you again, Chris, for being with us. If you haven't already, please, I implore you to join the Patreon. We do have an incredible catalog of videos, video versions of these episodes, which are also captioned. So please, if you feel entitled or feel inclined to, please join our Patreon. It's very, very nice. And you get to see our beautiful little faces. Please support Chris at Tarot Exegete on Instagram. My name is Voga, and I am Voga Illumiscente.
And I am Ry, aka the Mestizo Mystic.
and I'm Chris, Tarot Exegete.
And we will see you guys on our next Unholy Communion. Bye.